His first argument here is that there's such virtue in the blood of Christ because Jesus did actually suffer the legal and full curse of the offended and the broken law. And he does this in his body, in a real physical death where he actually suffers. And he gives a quote where he says, God was not angry with Christ for taking his office upon him, but for our sins. His anger was directed toward our sin, not because he took the office. God's wrath burned against him. God looked on him as if he were the guilty person. God looked upon him as the object of his vindictive justice. And Jesus was pursued by divine vengeance for our sins.
The second argument he gives for why there is such a virtue to cleanse our sins in the death of Christ is that Jesus suffered as the eternal Son of God and not just as the sinless man. And he gives a couple of verses here. 1 Corinthians 2:8, they crucified the Lord of glory. Acts 3:15, they killed the Prince of Life. This one really answers the objection that comes to our minds when we look at the magnitude of our sins. So we look at the frequency, perhaps, of a heinous sin. The repetitive nature in our life, and we wonder, have I sinned against God one too many times? Has the pile grown so high? And so it's good to contrast the size of our sin, which is terrible, with the infinite dignity and magnitude of the sin bearer. He is the Prince of Life. He is the Lord of glory. And there is no reason to fear that our sin is too great for that cross.
I do think it's important to make some distinctions here. We have the God-man with two natures, and if we're not careful, we can come up with some really bad ideas. We understand it, and Stoddard mentions this, that Christ suffered in his humanity. The deity cannot suffer pain. Christ died in his humanity. The deity cannot die. God is eternal. And yet we can say that Jesus, the God-man, suffered and died because there is one person with two natures, and he endured all of that. And his deity lent such dignity to his humanity that this sacrifice becomes of infinite value.
Yeah, that's really important to keep. One person, two natures, not two persons with a mingled nature.
Yeah, and if you can go too far one way and think that the deity of Christ died somehow, which is problematic. But you could also go too far the other way and think because the deity cannot be touched with that, we could say, that the humanity somehow was lessened, and the sacrifice was lessened, and it does not bear the dignity that it actually does.
He mentions also that the suffering was of a perfectly holy sacrifice. And we see that foreshadowed in the Old Testament, the spotless lamb. We see that clearly described in the New Testament. John 14, at the end of that chapter when he's with his disciples, the night of his crucifixion, he tells them that they need to get up and leave the room. They're going to go out to Gethsemane. And he says to them, it's time for us to get up and leave because the evil one has nothing in me. I'm not going to go and be taken and crucified because of anything wrong in me, but because there's nothing wrong in me, he can be the sacrifice. And I think that applies in a second way to the objections of the heart, not just the bigness of my sin, but the shamefulness, the stain, the dirtiness of every sin. And when we see them as God sees them, as we begin to see them more clearly, then there might be that feeling that nothing could ever make me right with God now. And so we must contrast the horrible stain of every sin with the infinitely beautiful holiness of the sacrifice and find all of our confidence there.
Yeah. I think this is probably, to me, one of the sweetest points and one of the most astounding to think about too, that Christ, holy not just in lack of original sin, but actual sin, that he does not commit any deeds that are sinful, but thoughts and attitudes, and no sin not only of commission, but of omission. He omits nothing that is right to do. It's just really remarkable. No cause to blush,